The hammer struck the fence post, a sharp crack splitting the morning silence. Sam Carter squinted under the merciless New Mexico sun, sweat rolling from his temples and disappearing into the stubble along his jaw. Each swing felt heavier than the last, but he didn't slow. The Longhorns needed to be kept in, and there wasn't another soul for miles to help him. That was how Sam preferred it, alone, just him and the dust. A breeze stirred, carrying the dry scent of mesquite and sun-baked earth. Beyond the pasture, the land stretched out in rippling shades of brown and rust, broken only by scattered rocks and stubborn sagebrush. Somewhere far off, a coyote barked once, then silence fell again. This was his world, wide, empty, and without judgment. Sam leaned on the handle of the hammer, eyes scanning the fence line, the cattle grazing with lazy tails flicking at flies. The sound of their bells, soft, metallic chimes, echoed like distant memories. Inside the small cabin, the air was cooler but no less lonely. The place bore the signs of a man who had long since stopped expecting company: a single wooden chair, a pine table scarred with knife cuts, a shelf with a few tin plates, and a rifle hanging near the door. On the mantel above the cold hearth sat two small relics: a faded photograph of a woman holding a young girl, and a folded handkerchief with delicate stitching. Sam never touched them unless the night grew too quiet, the way it often did when the wind scraped over the roof. He filled a tin cup with water from a jug, drinking slowly. The liquid warm, but enough to ease the dryness in his throat. His gaze lingered on the photo. Mary and Anna. The names rose in his mind, though he hadn't spoken them aloud in years. He placed the cup down carefully, as if noise might disturb something fragile. The Bible rested on the table near his bed. The leather cover was cracked, corners softened by time and use. Sam set one hand on it, bowing his head for a brief, silent prayer. He didn't ask for much, never had. Just the strength to see another day, to keep his land, and maybe, in some quiet way, to remember the people he'd lost without it breaking him. When he lifted his head, the sunlight spilling through the single window had shifted. Morning was slipping away. He had to go into town. He hated it. Dust Creek Crossing was always too loud, too curious. But the barrel of flour was nearly empty, the salt gone, and the kerosene low. He strapped on his weathered boots, slid the rifle into its scabbard on the wagon, and loaded 3 cured hides to trade. The leather still carried the sharp scent of smoke and fat from the tanning pit. Sam tightened the harness on his mule, the creak of leather straps loud in the still air. As he climbed onto the wagon seat, his gaze drifted across the open ridge. For 9 years, nothing had changed out there. No laughter, no voices but his own. Sometimes that was a comfort. Other times it felt like a weight pressing against his ribs. He clicked his tongue, and the mule lurched forward, hooves kicking up clouds of red dust. The trail to town was rough and winding, 2 hours of ruts and sunburned ground. Sam didn't mind the ride. The quiet gave him space to think, though his thoughts rarely wandered far from the past. He remembered the fever, how fast it had come, how helpless he had been. Mary's hand, limp and hot. Anna's face, pale and sweating, staring past him as though she could already see a better place. He had sat by their bed, wiping their foreheads with cool cloths, whispering prayers that went unanswered. He shook the memory away and adjusted the brim of his hat. The sun was climbing high now, bright and unforgiving. The wagon wheels clattered over stones, each jolt a reminder of the years etched into his bones. By the time the first buildings of Dust Creek Crossing came into view, low wooden structures pressed against the hills, Sam had already decided he'd do what he always did: trade his goods, buy what he needed, and leave without a word. Townsfolk remembered too much, asked questions he didn't want to answer. He didn't care for the stares or the way people talked as though silence was a flaw.
He guided the mule past the saloon, the hitching posts crowded with horses, and turned into the stable yard. The air smelled of hay and iron, mixed with the faint tang of whiskey from across the street. Sam tied the mule, straightened his coat, and reached for one of the hides. His boots crunched against the gravel as he made his way toward the trading post.
Another day, another trade. Nothing more. Or so he thought. The sound of voices reached him before he stepped inside the trading post. Low at first, then louder, sharper, as if a crowd had gathered for something worth watching. Sam paused, one hand still on the doorframe, listening. It wasn't the usual chatter of men bargaining over feed or whiskey. There was an edge to it, mocking laughter, the kind that carried a mean streak. He turned his head slightly, following the noise to the far end of the main street. A cluster of townsfolk had gathered outside the jail, their bodies forming a tight circle around something or someone. Men in rolled-up sleeves leaned against hitching rails, spitting tobacco, their grins mean and amused. Women stood with arms crossed, babies balanced on their hips, faces curious but not kind. Two boys hurled small stones at a fence post, bored but lingering. Sam adjusted the hide on his shoulder, intending to ignore it. He didn't like crowds. He didn't like trouble. But as he took a step toward the trading post, the sheriff's voice cut through the din. $5, 5, and she's yours. I'll even throw in the rope. Laughter erupted. The tone wasn't just cruel, it was ugly, tinged with something darker. Sam froze, jaw tightening. He turned his head slowly, almost against his better judgment. Tied to the hitching post in front of the jail was a woman, a young Apache woman, though not a girl. Her hair, long and black as midnight, hung in tangled strands against her face. Her dress, once crafted with care from deerskin and beads, was shredded, the fabric torn across the shoulder and bodice. Her skin was sunburned and streaked with dust and blood, her ankles swollen from the coarse rope that bound them. Yet she stood upright, chin lifted, dark eyes fixed somewhere beyond the jeering crowd, as if she refused to see them at all. Sam's hand tightened on the hide he carried. He had seen that look before, back in the war, in fever tents, in the faces of those who knew they were near the end but wouldn't surrender to fear. It wasn't weakness, it was defiance. A man beside him muttered, "She ain't worth the trouble. Stubborn as hell, won't bow or beg. 3 days she's been out here. Sheriff says he'll let the coyotes have her by sundown." The words hit Sam harder than he expected. He looked again, really looked. Her chest rose and fell too fast. Heat exhaustion was written across her cracked lips and blistered collarbone. Still, she didn't cry. She didn't even blink. He thought of Mary and Anna, thought of how their eyes had looked when the fever claimed them. Still, quiet, staring past him as though they'd already stepped beyond the reach of this world. He'd sat helpless at their bedside, wiping sweat from his little girl's neck, whispering prayers that never came true. Sam set the hide down by the trading post wall. He reached into his coat and pulled out $5 silver, heavy and cold in his calloused hand. Without a word, he walked toward the sheriff. The crowd fell silent for a moment, surprise cutting through their cruelty. Sheriff Clay Dawson squinted, his flask dangling from one hand. "You serious, Carter? $5 for her?" Sam nodded once. The sheriff's brow furrowed, but he took the coins, stacking them slowly as if testing Sam's resolve. A woman in the crowd scoffed. One of the boys muttered, "Guess she's his problem now." Sam ignored them. He moved toward the hitching post, crouching slightly to cut the rope with his pocket knife. The woman flinched when the blade scraped the hemp, but she didn't resist. Up close, Sam could feel the heat radiating from her skin. She was burning up with fever. He didn't speak. He didn't touch her more than necessary, just eased the ropes from her wrists and ankles. When she swayed on her feet, he caught her gently under the arms and lifted her into his arms, carrying her as though she weighed nothing. Her head rested against his shoulder, her dark eyes still open, still unbroken. The crowd didn't cheer or jeer now. They just watched, murmuring among themselves as Sam carried her past them to the wagon. He laid her carefully on the stack of hides in the back, covering her with a worn wool blanket. She made no sound, only shifted slightly, her breathing shallow but steady. Sam climbed onto the wagon seat. With a flick of the reins, the mule started forward. Dust rose behind them, soft and red in the evening light. He didn't look back. As the town slipped out of sight, Sam glanced over his shoulder at the still form lying on the hides. Something in his chest tightened, not pity, but something colder and sharper. An understanding. Maybe God was asking him for one last stand, not on a battlefield, but for a single soul. Everyone's interaction means a lot to me. Please share your favorite number in the comments. The mule pulled the wagon slowly up the winding path toward the ridge, its hooves thudding against the dry earth. Sam Carter kept one hand steady on the reins, the other resting near his rifle, though his eyes kept drifting to the back of the wagon. Aiyana lay there on the pile of hides, curled beneath the wool blanket. She hadn't spoken once during the ride, not even a whisper. Her chest rose and fell in shallow rhythm, but her eyes remained open, fixed on nothing. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows over the hills, and Sam wondered if she'd survive the night. The cabin came into view, a squat structure of sun-bleached logs and a roof patched with tin. A few longhorns grazed near the fence, and the old windmill creaked as the breeze picked up. Sam pulled the wagon to a stop, climbed down, and stepped toward the back. Aiyana's face was streaked with dirt, her lips cracked, and her dark hair clung to her cheeks. She flinched slightly when his shadow fell over her, but she didn't resist when he slid his arms beneath her shoulders and knees. "You'll be all right," he muttered, though he wasn't sure if she understood. His voice sounded rough, almost foreign in his own ears. He hadn't spoken much these past years. The cabin's interior was dim, lit only by the fading light slipping through the shutters. Sam carried her inside and set her down gently on a pile of furs near the stone hearth. For a moment he just stood there, hands resting on his knees, studying her. She wasn't weak in spirit, he could see that, but her body was worn thin, scraped and blistered from days of sun and rope. He fetched a tin cup, filled it with cool water from the barrel, and placed it near her. She looked at it, then at him, eyes dark and guarded. Without a word, she reached out and took it, sipping slowly. Sam watched her throat move as she swallowed, then turned away to give her space. The cabin told its own story. In the corner sat a bed frame draped with a single blanket, unmade. A wooden chair leaned against the wall beside a table scarred by years of knife cuts and candle burns. On the shelf above the hearth rested a few simple items: a ceramic bowl, a tin plate, and a small photograph in a cracked frame. The picture showed a woman holding a young girl, both smiling shyly. Sam's gaze lingered on it for a heartbeat too long before he forced himself to look away. He stoked the fire, adding dry pine logs until the crackle filled the silence. The warmth began to spread through the room, painting the walls with soft orange light. Aiyana shifted slightly, tucking the blanket around her shoulders. She hadn't made a sound, but her eyes followed him now, watchful, as though waiting to see what kind of man he was. Sam busied himself with small tasks, filling a pot with water, slicing dried meat, adding a handful of beans. The scent of smoke and boiling broth soon replaced the chill air. He set the pot near the edge of the hearth, then sat down in his worn chair, hat in his hands. For a while he simply listened. The pop of the fire, the wind rattling the shutters, the distant lowing of cattle. Aiyana shifted again, drawing his attention. She wasn't asleep. Her eyes, though heavy with exhaustion, still held a quiet fire. She was alive, but not broken. That stubborn pride, he understood it. It was the same thing that had kept him standing all these years when grief had tried to tear him apart. "You can rest here," he said softly, though he didn't know why he felt the need to say it. She didn't respond, just clutched the blanket tighter. Outside, dusk settled like a curtain. The last of the light slipped behind the ridge, and the cabin glowed faintly from the fire within. Sam leaned back in the chair, hat resting on his knee. He didn't know her name, didn't know why she'd been tied to that post, but he knew one thing: she wasn't going back to that town, not while he was breathing. The first night passed in silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the soft sound of breathing from the corner near the hearth. Sam Carter slept lightly in his bed, boots still on, the rifle resting close by. Years alone had taught him to trust nothing but caution, yet his ears tuned unconsciously to every faint rustle, every shift of weight from the woman lying on the furs. Aiyana hadn't stirred much, too exhausted, he guessed, but when the first pale light crept through the cracks in the shutters, Sam was already awake. He moved quietly, pulling on his coat and lacing his boots before stepping outside. The air was sharp with morning chill, and the land was still except for the low grumble of the cattle in the pasture. He fed them, checked the fence line, and hauled a fresh bucket of water from the well. By the time he returned, the cabin smelled of smoke and pine, and the woman was sitting upright, wrapped tightly in the blanket. Her eyes, dark and sharp, followed him as he set the water down. Sam didn't speak. He knelt near the fire, stirred the coals, and added more wood. The pot of beans from the night before still sat near the hearth, cooled to a thick stew. He ladled some into a tin bowl, set it on the floor a few feet from her, and stepped back. Aiyana hesitated, her gaze flicking from the bowl to his face, as if trying to gauge his intentions. Finally, she reached forward, her fingers trembling slightly, and pulled the bowl closer. She ate slowly, spoon scraping against the tin, her posture still tense. He watched only long enough to see that she was eating before turning to his own tasks. There was no need for words, not yet. Some things were better understood through action. He hung his coat by the door, poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove, and sat in the chair with the rifle resting across his knees. He wasn't afraid of her, she was too weak to be a threat, but old habits kept him guarded. Hours passed in a kind of rhythm. Sam worked outside, repairing a section of the corral and stacking firewood, while Aiyana remained near the hearth, her eyes following him through the open doorway. At midday, when he stepped inside, he found the tin bowl cleaned and placed neatly by the fire. She hadn't spoken, but there was a quiet acknowledgement in the way she glanced at him, as if to say she understood this was not a cage. She was here because he'd chosen not to leave her behind. By evening, the air had turned cool again. Sam brought in a small pail of water and set it near her, gesturing for her to drink. She did, her hands cupping the tin cup carefully, the steam from the warm water rising to touch her face. He noticed, for the first time, the patterns of beads and faded thread on what was left of her dress. Details that hinted at a life before this suffering. She had once been part of something vibrant and proud. The sight stirred something inside him, though he pushed it down. Later, as the fire dimmed, Sam took the chair near the door, hat tilted low over his eyes. Aiyana curled again on the furs, watching him through half-lidded eyes. Neither spoke, but there was less tension in the room now, a fragile thread of understanding weaving between them. When the wind rose outside, rattling the shutters, she flinched slightly, pulling the blanket tighter. Sam's gaze lifted, and their eyes met for the first time all day. He gave a small nod, just enough to say, "You're safe here." She held his gaze for a moment before closing her eyes. For the first time in years, Sam felt something shift inside the cabin. Not comfort, not yet, but the beginning of a bond forged in silence. The third morning dawned gray, with a thin veil of clouds drifting low over the ridge. Sam Carter rose as he always did, without an alarm, simply because the habit of early mornings was carved into his bones. He lit the stove, stirred the embers in the hearth, and stepped outside to feed the cattle. The air smelled faintly of rain, though no drops had yet fallen. When he returned, he found Aiyana sitting upright near the fire, the blanket draped over her shoulders like a shawl. She was watching him, her dark eyes steady, almost expectant. For a moment, Sam froze in the doorway. Something about her gaze was different today. It wasn't just the guarded stare of a woman trying to survive. There was focus in it, like she had made a decision overnight. "You need more water?" he asked quietly, setting down a pail. Her lips parted, but no words came. Then she pointed at her chest, fingers splayed lightly over her heart. "Aiyana," she said, her voice low, hoarse from days of silence. Sam blinked. The sound of her voice, rough but clear, cut through the room like a bell. He set the pail down and nodded. "Aiyana," he repeated, careful with the syllables. She pointed to him then, tilting her head, waiting. "Sam," he said. "Samuel Carter." "Aiyana," she said again, pressing her hand to her chest as if to claim the word. Then she lifted her hand slightly, motioning to him. "Sam." It wasn't much of a conversation, but something passed between them in that simple exchange. For the first time since he had found her, there was acknowledgement, a small thread of trust. Sam sat down in his chair, the old wood creaking under his weight. "What's it mean?" he asked softly, not expecting an answer. She hesitated, her brow furrowing, then touched her chest again and mimed the blooming of a flower with her fingers. "Forever, flowering," she said, her accent wrapping around the English words. Sam's gaze dropped for a moment, his thumb rubbing absently over the brim of his hat. Forever flowering. The meaning lingered with him, carrying a weight he couldn't name. That afternoon, he worked outside mending the water trough, while Aiyana rested by the door, her eyes following his movements. At one point, she stood, bare feet touching the dusty ground, and walked slowly to the water barrel. She cupped water in her hands, washing the dust from her face. The beads of water on her skin glistened in the sunlight. "You shouldn't be on your feet yet," Sam said, his tone more protective than he intended. Aiyana looked at him but said nothing, only straightened her back, her pride intact. There was strength there, more than he expected from someone who had been tied to a post just 2 days ago. When dusk came, they sat by the fire. Sam ladled stew into 2 tin bowls. She took hers quietly, but after a moment she looked at him, eyes narrowed with curiosity. "Sam? Soldier?" she asked, the word halting but deliberate. He froze, the spoon hovering above his bowl. "Was," he said. His voice was low, heavy. "Union cavalry, long time ago." She seemed to understand. Her gaze softened slightly, as if sensing the weight behind the word. He didn't offer more, but a memory flashed through his mind. Muddy battlefields, smoke, the cries of men he'd left behind. And later, coming home to a house filled with silence and the sickness that would take his wife and little girl. He cleared his throat, setting the bowl aside. "Eat," he said, not looking at her. Aiyana studied him for another moment, then dipped her spoon, eating slowly. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, tapping softly against the roof. Sam watched the flames dance in the hearth, feeling that something between them had shifted. She had given him her name, and with it, a piece of herself. The rain from the previous night left the ground damp and dark, the scent of wet earth lingering in the morning air. Sam Carter hitched the mule to the wagon just after sunrise, planning to head into Dust Creek Crossing for supplies. He hadn't intended to take Aiyana with him, not yet, but something in her watchful stare as he prepared to leave made him pause. She was still too weak to be left alone for long. "You'll stay inside," he said, gesturing toward the cabin. But Aiyana shook her head once, firm, her dark eyes steady. She wasn't asking for permission. She was telling him she would not be left behind. Sam sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Fine," he muttered, "but you keep close." The wagon wheels cut through the mud as they rolled toward town. Aiyana sat in the back, wrapped in her repaired blanket, her posture upright despite the rough ride. Sam could feel her eyes on the horizon, unflinching, like a hawk scanning for danger. By the time they reached Dust Creek Crossing, the small town was already stirring. Shopkeepers swept their porches, and the clink of metal echoed from the blacksmith's forge. Yet, as soon as Sam's wagon creaked into the main street, conversations quieted, heads turned. "There he is," a man murmured from the steps of the saloon. "Brought her back with him." Sam felt the weight of a dozen eyes, their stare sharp with judgment and curiosity. He climbed down from the wagon, his expression flat, and tied the mule to a post. Aiyana followed slowly, her bare feet silent on the boards. The sheriff's office door swung open. Sheriff Clay Dawson stepped onto the porch, thumbs hooked into his belt. He was a tall man with a round belly and a thin, mocking smile. "Carter," he called, voice carrying across the street. "Heard you picked yourself up a little trouble the other day." Sam turned, his face unreadable. "Bought her freedom," he said evenly. The sheriff chuckled. "Freedom? Ain't sure that's what you did. Government marks her as tribal property. She ain't yours to keep." "She's not property," Sam said, his tone like gravel. The townsfolk stirred at the tension in his voice. A few women glanced between the two men, their faces tight with disapproval. Sheriff Clay tilted his head, his smile fading. "Listen, Carter, I'm only telling you this for your own good. The kind of folks who want an Apache girl back don't take kindly to someone standing in their way. Best you hand her over before you end up regretting it." Sam's jaw clenched. He stepped closer, closing the gap between them. "She's with me now. That's the end of it." For a long moment, they stared each other down. Finally, the sheriff gave a slow, mocking nod. "All right, Carter. We'll see how long that lasts." Sam didn't respond. He turned on his heel, motioning for Aiyana to follow him into the trading post. Inside, the storekeeper's eyes widened slightly at the sight of her, but said nothing, simply weighing the hides and counting out the flour, salt, and coffee Sam needed. Aiyana stood beside him the entire time, silent but unshaken. When they left, the sheriff was still on the porch, watching them with a smirk that promised trouble. Sam didn't look back. He helped Aiyana onto the wagon and set the mule toward home, the stares of the townsfolk following until the buildings faded into the dust behind them. Back on the open trail, Sam exhaled slowly, gripping the reins tighter than he needed to. "They'll talk," he muttered, mostly to himself. Aiyana sat quietly in the back, her gaze fixed on the horizon. But when he glanced over his shoulder, he caught her looking at him, measuring him, as if weighing his words against the man he was becoming in her eyes. The days that followed passed in a quiet rhythm, a fragile peace holding between them like a thread stretched taut. The air turned warmer, the sun biting during the midday hours. Sam Carter worked the ranch as he always had, mending fences, hauling water, checking on the longhorns, while Aiyana began to move through the cabin with a kind of purposeful grace, no longer the silent figure wrapped in a blanket by the hearth. It started small.
One morning, when Sam returned from the pasture, he found the floor swept clean, pine needles gathered and burned in the fire pit to chase away the stale smell of smoke. His old work shirt, stained from weeks of dust and sweat, had been washed and was hanging on a makeshift rope line near the window, dripping clean water onto the wooden floorboards. She didn't look at him as he noticed her work, just continued to twist water from another cloth with her strong, scarred hands. "You don't have to do that," he said gruffly.
Aiyana's head lifted, her gaze meeting his. "I do," she replied simply, her voice low but firm. Sam wasn't sure how to respond. Instead, he reached for the shirt, ran a hand over the damp fabric, and gave a slight nod, his way of saying thank you. That afternoon, Aiyana ventured outside for the first time without his prompting. She walked barefoot across the yard, her steps careful but steady, and examined the sagging fence near the chicken coop. Sam watched from the porch, leaning against a post. She turned to him and gestured, pointing at the fallen boards and miming a repair. "You planning on fixing that yourself?" he asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. She tilted her chin upward, that unspoken pride flashing in her eyes. Sam sighed and grabbed the hammer and nails. "All right then, let's see what you can do." Together they worked in silence, side by side under the wide, relentless sky. Sam held the boards in place while Aiyana handed him nails and steadied the hammer. At one point, their hands brushed, an unremarkable moment, yet it sent a ripple through the quiet. Sam caught her looking at him, her dark eyes thoughtful, not fearful. Later, as dusk settled, they sat on the porch steps. The horizon burned gold and red, the kind of sunset that made the land look alive for a fleeting moment. Aiyana hummed softly, a low, melodic sound in a language Sam didn't know but felt in his chest. He didn't interrupt. Instead, he closed his eyes, letting the tune carry him somewhere far away, somewhere quieter than the war, quieter than the memories of his wife and child. "Garden," Aiyana said suddenly, pointing toward the patch of bare soil near the shed. Sam blinked, opening his eyes. "Soil's no good for planting," he said. She crouched, scooping up a handful of dirt, rubbing it between her fingers before letting it fall. "Try," she said simply. He studied her for a long moment. She wasn't asking, she was challenging him, in her quiet, unyielding way. Sam rubbed a hand over his jaw. "We'll see." That night, when they shared their supper, venison stew and a small piece of bread, Sam found himself watching her in the firelight. Her face was softer now, the bruises fading, but her strength was more evident than ever. She had endured everything the world threw at her, and she still found the will to plant something, to build. When Aiyana caught him looking, she didn't shy away. She simply raised a brow, as if daring him to say something. Sam gave a faint smile, barely a flicker, but enough to be noticed. For the first time in a long while, the cabin didn't feel quite so empty. The sky darkened without warning, heavy clouds rolling in from the east like an army on the march. By mid-afternoon, the light over the ridge had turned the color of steel, and the wind carried the sharp, metallic scent of rain. Sam Carter had seen enough summer storms to know this one would not pass quietly. "Get everything inside," he muttered, moving quickly to the yard. He secured the wagon under the lean-to, hammered down the coop door, and hustled the mule into the shed. Aiyana, without waiting for instruction, was already gathering the furs from outside and covering the firewood pile with a scrap of tarp. She moved with quick, sure motions, her hair whipping across her face as the wind howled. The first crack of thunder boomed across the land, deep and rattling. Sam glanced over his shoulder to see Aiyana bracing a shutter against the cabin wall, nailing it down with a hammer she'd grabbed from the porch. There was no fear in her expression, only focus. He couldn't help but pause a moment, watching her work with the same grit he'd seen in hardened soldiers.
"Inside now," he called as the rain began to spit. She shot him a look, half defiance, half understanding, and jogged to the door. Sam followed, the storm breaking loose just as he closed the latch behind them. Rain hammered the roof, sheets of water racing down the windows. The cabin felt smaller with the storm pressing against it, the air alive with the crackle of lightning. Aiyana sat near the fire, her damp dress clinging to her shoulders, chest rising and falling with each measured breath. Sam poured hot water into 2 tin cups, passing one to her. Their fingers brushed, and this time neither of them pulled away too quickly. She drank, slow and deliberate, her eyes never leaving his face. When the cup was half empty, she set it down and asked in her rough, halting English, "Why?" Sam raised an eyebrow. "Why what?" Aiyana's gaze was sharp, unwavering. "Why, you pay." The question hit harder than he expected. Sam leaned back, staring into the flames.
The memory of that day in town, of her standing tied to the post with her head held high, came back to him like a flash of lightning. He didn't answer right away. "Because no one else would," he said finally, voice low, almost gravel. "And I don't stand by while someone's spirit gets crushed." Aiyana studied him, as if measuring the truth in his tone. Her lips parted, but she didn't speak right away. Instead, she shifted slightly closer to the fire, the orange glow tracing the strong lines of her face. "My sister," she said after a long pause. "They take her first. I don't know where she is." Sam's chest tightened. He wanted to tell her that she'd find her sister, that he'd help if he could. But he'd learned long ago not to make promises the world might not let him keep. He only said, "If I hear anything, I'll tell you." She nodded once, slow and deliberate, then looked back at the fire. For a long time, they sat in silence, listening to the rain beat against the walls. The storm raged on, wind rattling the cabin as if trying to tear it apart. When lightning flashed through the cracks in the shutters, Aiyana flinched slightly, her fingers tightening around the blanket. Sam noticed, his hand brushing over the edge of the chair as though he wanted to reach out but wasn't sure if he should. Finally, she looked at him again. "Sam," she said softly, like she was testing the sound of his name on her tongue. "Yeah?" "You good, man," she whispered. Sam swallowed hard. He wasn't sure he believed it, but for some reason, hearing it from her felt like the first honest thing he'd heard in years. If you found this helpful, a quick like really helps us keep creating. The day was warm and unearthingly still, the kind of stillness that made Sam Carter's instincts sharpen. He was hauling water from the creek when he heard it, the distant crunch of hooves on dry soil. Not the slow, meandering sound of a ranch hand or a neighbor passing through, but a purposeful approach, each step deliberate. Sam set down the bucket, his hand automatically moving to the revolver holstered at his hip. His gaze swept across the ridge, narrowing, as a lone rider came into view, cutting through the dusty light like a dark stain. Eli Turner. Sam recognized him even from a distance. Lean frame, hat tilted low, a grin like a wolf sizing up its prey.
Eli had a reputation that carried across counties, a bounty hunter when it suited him, a trader of flesh and fear when it didn't. He was the kind of man who thrived on the suffering of others, and Sam's gut tightened at the sight of him. The rider stopped a few yards from the porch. "Afternoon, Carter," Eli called, voice slick with mock courtesy. "Heard you picked up something that doesn't belong to you." Sam's fingers brushed the grip of his revolver, though he didn't draw it yet. "She's not something," he said evenly, "and she's not yours." Eli's grin widened. "That Apache girl, Aiyana, ain't it? She was marked to be sold in Dust Creek. Sheriff said you bought her out, but I reckon I've got more claim than you. Hand her over and we can both walk away with no trouble." Behind Sam, the cabin door creaked open. Aiyana stepped into the shadow of the porch, silent but watchful. Her face showed no fear, only a calm defiance that seemed to catch Eli off guard. Sam shifted slightly, blocking Eli's view of her with his own frame. "You ride off this land, Turner, right now. She's free, and she stays free." Eli's chuckle was low, unpleasant. "You got guts, old man."
But guts don't count for much when the law says she's property. You think you can stand between me and what's mine? Sam's jaw clenched. Try me. A tense silence stretched between them, broken only by the faint rustle of wind across the dry grass. Eli's hand hovered near his holster for a moment before he pulled his reins, smirking. "I'll be back," he said, "and I won't be alone." Sam didn't flinch. He watched Eli turn his horse and ride off, dust swirling in his wake. Only when the rider disappeared over the ridge did Sam glance back at Aiyana. Her eyes met his, dark and steady, and for the first time he saw a flicker of trust there. Eli Turner's shadow lingered long after he vanished over the ridge. Sam Carter spent the rest of the afternoon checking the ranch, tightening fence gates, counting ammunition, making sure every tool and weapon was where it needed to be. The air felt heavy, as though the land itself was holding its breath. Aiyana watched him from the porch. She had changed since the day he'd first carried her here, her posture straighter, her eyes sharper, as if the land had given her some of its unshakable strength. When Sam came back from the barn with his rifle slung over his shoulder, she stepped closer. "Eli," she said softly, testing the name. "Bad man." Sam paused, surprised she knew the name. Then again, she'd likely seen men like Eli before, men who treated people as if they were nothing but coin. "Yeah," he said, "he's trouble, and trouble doesn't ride out without coming back harder." She tilted her head, studying him. "You afraid?" Sam met her gaze. "Not for me." He glanced at the rifle in his hand. "But I won't let anyone take you back to that life, not while I'm breathing." Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Instead, she stepped closer, close enough for him to see the quiet gratitude in her eyes. By late afternoon, the sky had taken on a copper hue, the sun dipping low and casting long stretched shadows across the yard. Sam stood on the porch, rifle resting in the crook of his arm, eyes scanning the distant trail. He wasn't a man who sought fights anymore. War and loss had bled that hunger out of him years ago. But there were some lines he would not let anyone cross. Eli's voice from earlier replayed. Sam's jaw tightened. He thought of his wife, of his daughter, both gone, both taken by a sickness he couldn't fight. Back then, he'd been powerless. But this he could fight. Aiyana stepped beside him, barefoot on the wooden boards. "If I stay, danger comes?" she asked, her voice quiet. Sam looked at her, the firelight from the cabin door brushing across her face. "Danger's already here," he said. "But you're free. You stay if you choose. No one's taking that from you." She nodded, slow and sure. For the first time, Sam felt not just the weight of his words, but their truth. The next morning, the quiet of the ranch broke under the sound of approaching hooves. More than one horse this time. Sam Carter spotted the dust cloud long before the riders crested the hill. He counted 3 men. Eli Turner had returned, just as he promised, and he hadn't come alone. Sam set his coffee mug down on the porch rail, the liquid still steaming in the cool morning air. "Stay inside," he told Aiyana, his voice low but firm. Aiyana's dark eyes narrowed. "I help," she said. "This isn't your fight," Sam replied, checking the revolver on his hip. "Not yet." But Aiyana didn't move toward the door. Instead, she crossed her arms and stood just behind him, quiet but unyielding. Sam didn't push it. He understood stubbornness well enough to know it wouldn't bend. Eli and his 2 men rode into the yard, their horses snorting, the smell of leather and sweat thick in the air. Eli dismounted with a cocky grin. "Mornin', Carter," he said, adjusting his hat. "Told you I'd be back. Seems I'm a man of my word." Sam didn't return the smile. "You brought friends. Guess you didn't like the answer I gave you yesterday." Eli shrugged. "You're a tough old man. Figured you'd need convincin'." He gestured toward the cabin with a nod of his head. "Hand her over and nobody gets hurt. We'll be gone before the sun's high." Sam rested the rifle across his arms, his stance unshaken. "She's free," he said evenly, "and if you try to take her, you'll have to go through me." One of Eli's men, a broad-shouldered brute with a scar across his jaw, spat in the dirt. "We can manage that." Aiyana stepped forward then, just enough that the men saw her. She didn't cower. Her posture was straight, her gaze sharp and unwavering. Something about her quiet defiance made Eli pause, but only for a moment. Sam caught the hesitation, used it. "You think I'm alone out here?" he said, voice calm but edged with steel. "You think I don't know how to hold this land? You take one step toward her, you won't leave this yard." The standoff lingered, tension humming like a taut wire. Eli smirked but stepped back toward his horse. "You've got until sundown, Carter," he said. "After that, we're coming back and we'll finish this proper." Sam's jaw tightened as the men rode off, their laughter carried on the wind. Sundown was hours away, but the war had already begun. The sun sank low, casting the sky in shades of fire and ash. Every sound seemed sharper: the creak of the windmill, the distant rustle of dry grass, the slow ticking of Sam Carter's old pocket watch. Sundown. Sam stood on the porch, rifle in hand, his gaze fixed on the trail. Behind him, Aiyana moved quietly, stacking wood near the doorway to create a crude barricade. She hadn't said much since morning, but her silence carried no fear, only determination. "They'll come," Sam said, his voice low. "Eli's the kind who can't stand being told no." Aiyana stopped, meeting his eyes. "Then we stand," she replied simply. Sam almost smiled. She had fire in her, the same fire he'd once seen in his wife's eyes when she fought to keep their home alive through hard winters. He nodded, checking his rifle one last time. The first hooves sounded just as the sun dipped below the ridge. 3 riders again, but their approach was slower this time, deliberate. Eli Turner led the way, his grin sharp under the shadow of his hat. "Well, Carter," Eli called as he reined in near the fence line, "you had your chance to do this easy. Now we'll do it my way." Sam stepped off the porch, boots crunching against the hard-packed earth. "You step foot on my land, Turner, and you're not walking off." Eli laughed, but it was a hard, brittle sound. "You think you're the law out here? This isn't about right or wrong. It's about what I'm owed." He jerked his chin toward Aiyana, who stood in the doorway, unflinching. "That one's been nothing but trouble since the day we caught her. Best thing you can do is hand her over before you get yourself killed." Sam's voice was steady, but there was steel beneath it.
"I've buried enough good people to know the difference between what's owed and what's right. She's free. You want her, you'll have to kill me first." The words hung heavy in the air. Eli's hand hovered over his holster, his men shifting uneasily in their saddles. Aiyana's breath caught behind him, but she didn't move. The tension snapped like a whip. Eli drew his pistol, but Sam was already raising the rifle, his stance unshakable. "Last chance," Sam said, his voice low and deadly calm. Eli froze. For the first time, his grin faltered. The standoff stretched like a taut wire, neither man willing to blink first. Sam Carter's rifle stayed steady, his finger brushing the trigger, while Eli Turner's pistol gleamed in the dying light. The tension was so thick it seemed the wind itself had gone still. Then, from the west, came the distant thunder of hooves. Not the reckless rush of outlaws, but the measured, deliberate approach of someone who knew how to ride with authority. Eli's grin flickered, just for a moment. Sam didn't take his eyes off Eli, but he knew that sound. Thomas Reeves.
Moments later, a rider came into view, a tall man with a weathered coat and a badge pinned to his chest. Reeves dismounted with calm precision, his boots crunching on the dirt as he approached. "Eli Turner," he called out, his voice carrying clear and steady. "Step away from that gun." Eli spat into the dirt. "What's this? You sidin' with the old man now, Reeves?" Reeves stopped a few yards from them, one hand resting on the revolver at his hip. "I'm siding with the law, and the law says you've got no claim on that woman. You've been running your mouth in Dust Creek about auctions and slave trades. I've got witnesses and statements, enough to see you behind bars." A murmur of unease rippled through Eli's men. One of them shifted in his saddle, eyes darting between Sam's rifle and Reeves's badge. "You got no proof," Eli snapped, though his tone had lost some of its swagger. "I've got plenty," Reeves said evenly. "And you're about one bad decision away from adding murder to the list. You draw that pistol, Eli, and I'll make sure you don't live long enough to see a judge." Sam lowered his rifle just a fraction, enough to signal trust, but not surrender. "Your move, Turner," he said, his voice as sharp as the edge of a blade. Eli's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking between Sam and Reeves. The moment stretched. Finally, with a frustrated growl, he holstered his pistol and spat into the dirt again. "This isn't over," he muttered, swinging back into the saddle. Reeves didn't flinch. "It's over when I say it's over," he replied. "Now ride out before I take you in right here." Eli glared, but turned his horse, spurring it hard. His men followed, their silhouettes fading into the twilight. Sam exhaled slowly, the tension draining from his shoulders. Behind him, Aiyana stepped out onto the porch, her gaze fixed on Reeves. For the first time in days, Sam allowed himself to believe they might just be safe, at least for now. The dust hadn't even settled when Thomas Reeves stepped forward, his boots heavy against the dry earth. Sam Carter lowered his rifle, but his grip on the weapon was still firm. It would take more than a badge to convince him the danger had passed. "Eli won't come back tonight," Reeves said, wiping the dust from his coat. "But men like him don't give up easy. I'll see to it he's locked up for a while. The evidence I've got should keep him there." Sam gave a slow nod, his gaze lingering on the horizon where Eli and his men had vanished. "You always did show up right when the trouble peaked, Reeves." Reeves gave a faint smirk. "Lucky timing or bad habit? Take your pick." Aiyana stepped off the porch, barefoot, her dark hair brushing her shoulders. She studied Reeves for a long moment before giving a small nod of acknowledgement. Though she said nothing, her steady gaze conveyed a silent gratitude. "Is she all right?" Reeves asked quietly, glancing toward her. Sam's expression softened just slightly. "She's tougher than most I've met," he said. The three of them stood there for a beat, the quiet of the land returning after the storm of tension. Finally, Reeves clapped Sam on the shoulder.
I'll take the evidence to Dust Creek and see that Eli's mouth stays shut for a while. Folks in town need to hear the truth about what happened, about who he really is." Sam's jaw tightened. "And what about them hearing the truth about her?" Reeves looked at Aiyana, then back at Sam. "They'll hear she's free," he said firmly. "She's not property, not to anyone.
And if anyone says otherwise, they'll answer to me."
Aiyana's eyes flickered with something like relief, though her posture remained composed and proud. She turned her gaze to Sam, and in that moment there was a shift, an unspoken bond forged not from pity but respect. As Reeves mounted his horse and rode out, Sam and Aiyana stood together on the porch, watching the last trace of dust fade into the horizon. The tension that had gripped the ranch for days seemed to lift, replaced by a calm that felt almost foreign. Sam finally broke the silence. "You're safe now," he said, his voice low but certain. Aiyana looked at him, the corners of her mouth lifting in the faintest, most genuine smile he had ever seen from her. "Safe," she repeated softly, as if tasting the word for the first time. "If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey." The days after Eli Turner's arrest passed in a strange quiet, as if the land itself had exhaled a breath it had been holding.
For the first time in years, Sam Carter woke not to the weight of loneliness pressing against his chest, but to the sound of life. Soft footsteps on the porch, the gentle rustle of Aiyana sweeping dust from the cabin floor, the faint hum of a song he didn't recognize. The ranch was still the same stretch of dry earth and stubborn grass, but something had shifted. Aiyana had started working a small patch near the southern fence, kneeling in the soil with quiet determination. Sam stood at the edge of the yard one morning, arms folded, watching her plant the last row of beans. She didn't ask for help, but he found himself walking over anyway, the spade heavy but oddly comforting in his hand. "You think this ground will give anything?" Sam asked, half smiling. Aiyana glanced up, her dark eyes reflecting the early sunlight. "The earth listens if you give it time," she said simply. Then, with a small shrug, she added, "Like people." Sam chuckled softly, an unfamiliar sound that startled even him. It had been years since he'd laughed without bitterness. By the end of the week, green shoots began to break through the dry, cracked soil. Aiyana touched the leaves gently each morning, as if greeting them. To Sam, the sight of those tiny sprouts felt like a quiet promise that something new could still take root, even in the hardest ground. He started noticing little changes around the cabin, too. The once empty shelves now held herbs Aiyana had gathered from the creekside. His old tin mugs were always washed and neatly stacked. The air smelled faintly of wild mint when she boiled water at night. These were small things, but they made the cabin feel less like a place of ghosts and more like a home. One evening, as the sun burned red over the horizon, Sam found himself leaning against the porch rail, watching Aiyana hang a piece of clean, damp cloth by the fire. She worked in silence, her movements unhurried, graceful in a way that came from resilience rather than fragility. When she looked up and caught him staring, she didn't turn away. "You smile," she said quietly, almost as if it surprised her. Sam blinked. "I suppose I do," he replied. She tilted her head, a hint of curiosity softening her expression.
"Why now?" Sam looked out over the land, at the fields, the patched fences, the small green shoots climbing toward the light. He thought of his wife's laughter, long gone but not forgotten, and of the years he had spent trapped in silence. "Maybe because it feels like something's growing again," he said. The following week they made a trip into Dust Creek.
Sam needed supplies, and though the town still whispered when Aiyana walked beside him, the stares were different this time. Not quite so sharp, not quite so cruel. Sheriff Clay, who had once turned a blind eye to Eli's cruelty, tipped his hat when they passed. At the trading post, Aiyana stood close to Sam, her chin lifted proudly despite the murmurs. Sam noticed the change in her, too. She was no longer the woman tied to a hitching post, stripped of dignity. She was her own person, and the entire town could see it. On the way back to the ranch, the wagon creaked under the weight of flour, nails, and salt. Aiyana sat beside him, her braid resting over one shoulder, the wind carrying strands of her hair across her face.
She didn't speak, but her presence alone felt like something steady and sure, like the beat of a heart he thought had long gone quiet. For the first time in years, Sam felt that the ranch wasn't just a place he existed in. It was a place he wanted to keep alive. And somehow, with Aiyana there, it felt possible. The evening light turned the land gold, painting the ranch in warm hues that softened the hard lines of the fences and the worn boards of the cabin. Sam Carter stood by the small garden plot, watching the bean sprouts stretch higher each day. He could almost imagine the place as it might have been long ago, a home filled with laughter and life, instead of silence and shadows. Behind him, the sound of footsteps on the porch drew his attention. Aiyana walked toward him, barefoot as always, her dark hair unbound and moving with the breeze. In her hand, she carried a clay cup of water, which she knelt to pour at the base of the seedlings. "You care for them like they're children," Sam said quietly, leaning on the fence. She looked up, a soft smile touching her lips. "They live if someone believes they can," she answered. Then, after a pause, she added, "Same with people." The words lingered in the cooling air, sinking into Sam's chest like a truth he hadn't known he needed to hear. Later that night, they sat by the fire in the cabin. The day's work had left Sam's shoulders aching, but it was a good kind of tired, the kind that came from building something, not just surviving. Aiyana sat across from him, braiding her hair slowly, the firelight casting soft shadows on her face. After a long silence, she spoke. "Aiyana," she said, touching her chest, "do you know what it means?" Sam shook his head. "No, I never asked." Her voice was steady, almost like she was reciting something sacred. "It means eternal blossom, a flower that survives the storm, the drought, the fire, and still grows." She looked at him then, eyes clear and unwavering. "I survive. I stay." Sam's throat tightened. He had spent years convincing himself that nothing could grow in him again. Not hope, not joy, not love. But sitting there with her, with the scent of wood smoke and fresh earth in the air, he felt something break open inside. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and let out a slow breath.
"Then I'll stay too," he said simply. Aiyana tilted her head as if studying him, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then, with a quiet grace, she reached across the small table, her hand brushing his. The days that followed felt different. There were still fences to mend and cattle to tend, but the work seemed lighter when done together. Aiyana would sing softly in her own language while hanging laundry or grinding corn, and Sam found himself listening, memorizing the sound. Sometimes, in the evenings, she would sit beside him on the porch, both of them watching the horizon in companionable silence. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Sam noticed the beans had grown tall enough to cast shadows on the dirt. "You planted hope," he said softly, glancing at Aiyana. She looked at the garden, then back at him with a smile. "No," she said, "we did." On the final night of summer, the sky burned with streaks of crimson and gold. Sam and Aiyana stood side by the fence, looking out over the land that now felt like theirs, not just his. The wind stirred the grass, carrying the scent of warm earth and new life.
Sam glanced at her,
the corner of his mouth lifting into a rare but genuine smile. "Feels like this place has a heart again," he murmured. Aiyana rested her hand lightly on the fence post, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Because you gave it one," she said. As the sun sank behind the hills, casting long shadows across the ranch, Sam felt something he hadn't felt in nearly a decade: peace. Not the silence of grief, but the kind of peace that comes from knowing you're exactly where you're meant to be. They stayed there until the last light faded, two figures against the twilight, standing on land that had finally become a home. Step into true Wild West stories, where every tale is a journey into forgotten trails and quiet hearts. Through Sam and Aiyana's story, we honor resilience, love, and the human spirit that endures like the eternal horizon. Subscribe to feel the echoes of the past and the hope it still holds.